lots of questions, and I'm sure you'll want to be given the opportunity to absolutely assure us that everything is in place, that something as horrific as this can't happen again.
So, Chair, I was reflecting on this before the meeting, and as we see with the last answer, this development in the Met and our understanding of what went wrong has obviously taken place over quite a long period of time, and we have changes, as I mentioned back in the past, changes that are more contemporary and changes that may be required as a result of new understanding, Baroness Casey, or whatever the coroner says, or the HMI for that matter. I want to bring that all together in a more coherent manner for you and the public.
Thank you.
So that I can report more regularly on, and in more, perhaps slightly more structured way than I've ended up doing today, on where we are and what we've done and what we intend to do.
No, that's great, and as long as it's going in the right direction, and I'm sure we will go back to it, because obviously we're as upset as you must be, Commissioner. Okay, we're now moving the next sections on to my nighttime reading, which is the force management statement, which is gripping in itself, and the first section is prevention and deterrence. So I'll start off with Assembly Member Devonish.
It's so gripping I get to start. Thank you very much, Chair. Commissioner, starting with you and then the Deputy Mayor, please, and please be a bit more succinct in your answers, because I think we need to make up a little bit of time after the last section. How does the Met's force management statement support the Mayor's police and crime plan, please?
So the force management statement, for those that haven't read it, is quite an extensive document, as I think you were hinting at, and it is something that we have done, I think, for 3 years now, as required by the HMI. We find it a very useful document, albeit there's a lot of work that goes into it, to assess the state of our capability, broadly speaking. It was delayed in its publication this last time, as you know, but in essence it comes out annually, and we try to make sure that it fits well with our other business cycles, our planning and business cycle. You'll be aware that we have our strategy, the Met Direction, which has remained pretty much consistent, a few tweaks here and there over the last few years. In my view, the force management statement works in a helpful way to shine light on different aspects of our strategy and to say where we are likely to have challenges in the future, or currently do have, in terms of skills or resources or whatever. And it fits usefully, therefore, also with the police and crime plan, which I regard as quite compatible with the Met Direction, which is our strategy.
Deputy Mayor?
I don't really have much to add to what the Commissioner said, except just to also to, you know, when I became Deputy Mayor, the Met were developing the business plan, and obviously the force management statement provides a rich amount of data and analysis that goes into the business plan, and that is from the business plan that we, you know, we take our oversight, and also in terms of our really quite extensive performance management and quarterly performance reports. So they all do fit together. I think there's been, and I think the auditors show this as well, there has been great strides taken in the last couple of years for that alignment between City Hall Police and Crime Plan and the Met's business plan and strategy, and they really do align, and we will continue to work together to make sure, and clearly the Met have been very much involved in the development of the current draft police and crime plan, and we will continue to work together to make sure that there is that alignment between the Met's business plan and priorities and the Mayor's priorities, clearly.
Thank you. Commissioner, how has the Met improved officers' understanding of ASB powers, and what impact is this having on the ground, please?
I think a huge impact, actually. Whenever I go out, I see the officers using their ASB powers, particularly the neighbourhood teams, in a way that I would never have recognised even a few years ago. We have some brand new refreshed guides, toolkits, and indeed very usable videos to ensure that our officers have access to a full explanation of the powers and how to use them. I don't use those powers myself on a daily basis, and I was looking at them in the last few days, and they are very good. We have a central repository available on our intranet, which everyone accesses regularly, with all the guides to antisocial behaviour available. So if they want to look in quick time, even on their tablets, they can look something up and use that. We have a really active way of sharing best practice and illustrating how powers have worked, and this, these great examples by energetic, innovative, capable local officers, and we spread those around everybody else. There's a computer sort of system, as I would call it in my old-fashioned way, on which everything to do with antisocial behaviour, usage of powers is recorded, and that has some good guidance on it. So whenever you're inputting to that, you're reminded of what's available to you. And the last thing I would say, looking forward, is we are have just reviewed our neighbourhood officer training, and we are providing some extra kind of walkthrough scenarios to our neighbourhood officers so that they will feel even more confident in the use of the antisocial behaviour powers.
Thank you. And Commissioner, again, has the Met's ASB early intervention scheme proved effective, and is it used consistently across the Met?
So for those that don't know, it's probably you know this in some ways better than me, but many of you are working so closely locally with your teams. But it's a stepped approach to deal with people involved. And the idea is it's a preventative approach and trying to prevent future criminal behaviour by responding to any offending behaviour. Also highlights safeguarding issues, for example. It's a useful scheme. The ultimate aim, obviously, is to minimise antisocial behaviour overall and reduce the demand and cost to us and indeed other agencies and to the community. In essence, we have a series of warnings where intervention and diversion is offered at each stage, and then it culminates in the use of antisocial behaviour powers. It has worked well in general, I think. The key to, of course, all antisocial behaviour work really, though, is the partnership, and it depends sometimes, crucially, on intervention opportunities and diversion opportunities being made available by other agencies. It depends on a really good join-up between the local authority and the officer. But I could take you to many, many parts of London where people really do feel that it has had a good preventative approach, and the way in which we scale up, ending up with a community protection notice and potentially breaches of that, has really helped reduce antisocial behaviour in some areas.
But by saying that, is it being consistent across the whole Met, though, Commissioner?
I can't guarantee, of course, that it's absolutely consistent everywhere, I'm afraid, no. What I do know is that it's something that people are vibrant about and interested in and trying to learn from each other.
Thank you. And my final question, Commissioner, to what extent are ASB powers being used to reduce violence in London, and what is the impact, please?
It's an integral part of our approach to violence because, of course, many people who are engaged in regular, what you might call antisocial behaviour, are also prone either to escalating to violence or involved in violence. And I'm thinking here perhaps particularly people involved in street drug dealing and similar. It presents as an antisocial behaviour issue in many respects. People hanging around, they're noisy, they're annoying, but they're also drug dealing. And drug dealing is intimately linked, as you know, to violence, and our drug dealing hotspots are our violence hotspots. And so use of these powers against, let me stick with that example, those who are engaged in drug dealing has been really powerful, and even against some of the more sort of entrenched gangs, it has been powerful because actually when you go up the scale, we see people A, changing their behaviour, and B, being subject potentially to really significant restrictions on their lifestyle, and C, very significant action if they breach. And so I would say that my teams, in those areas where they are high violence wards or hyper-local neighbourhoods, where appropriate, they want to use these powers, and they do, and they're very pleased with what it allows them to do.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, the management statement says that the capacity within the Met to deal with issues such as antisocial behaviour remains insufficient. Prior to the estimated £1 billion of government cuts to police funding over the last 10 years, was the capacity to deal with antisocial behaviour at a sufficient level? And are you expecting that capacity to be at an adequate level once the new officers are delivered through the Officer Uplift programme?
Well, we certainly, in my time, have never had quite enough to do everything that people quite properly expect of us, and that's just the truth of it, and that sort of remains to date. Actually, if you think about antisocial behaviour and crime in general, in the noughties, I think you would have to say that our capability, in many respects, was less good than it is now, and secondly, that our crime rates were higher, and secondly, that antisocial behaviour was much, in many respects, the failings of the police nationally and in London to deal with antisocial behaviour effectively was a very high profile and vexed issue. And I think we have all got a lot better, and we have been given powers. And I've talked about the fact that the neighbourhood teams, which of course aren't as big as we would like them to be, and you would all like them to be, I'm sure, have really set about using the new powers and really tackling head-on the issues of antisocial behaviour. And when we get inspected, we were once seen as not at all good at this, and we're now seen as, I think, good in our use, not just of the powers, but in general in taking on antisocial behaviour. Now, I know that probably within a stone's throw of here, there'll be some persistent issue which is upsetting residents, and we haven't yet been able to actually stop it. It takes the partnership on every occasion, and some issues are difficult to cure. The new officers are very welcome, and we're looking forward to the second tranche of the town centre teams coming shortly, and then more officers in some of our most high violence wards. Dealing with antisocial behaviour will be one of the things they deal with, of course, not the only, but it will be an important thing they deal with, and I anticipate that you will see, visible change in relation to antisocial behaviour in those areas, and hopefully, because then some resources will be not required in those areas to be moved on to elsewhere in terms of response policing and that kind of thing, you'll also see reductions elsewhere. So we're very pleased, and I think it's going to be, a step change in how some of our streets feel.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Good morning, Commissioner. Commissioner, the Met has said that it aims to widen its engagement techniques to increase confidence and satisfaction. Has this work been successful, and what evidence is there to support this?
So over the last few years, we've been constantly looking at trying to be more creative about the way in which we communicate, listen, engage, and indeed explain ourselves. That, of course, has come into very sharp focus in the last 18 months since the dreadful killing of George Floyd, and then, of course, subsequent issues which we have touched on here and discussed on other occasions. We have invested very greatly in new people and new skills, and I think anybody, I hope watching from the outside, but certainly watching from the inside, would have seen over the last 18 months that we have stepped up and stepped up again. I think the reference that you are referring to is probably from our Rebuilding Trust plan, which is quite recent. So I can perhaps tell you some of the things that we are doing under that, but of course it's too early to say that they've had an enormous impact. So we will very shortly have a virtual summit building on the success of our Behind the Badge project. That's an initiative that promotes the work of local officers and gives a face to the officers. So we're going to have this virtual event, and we'll be using hyper-local influencers to lead the event, and we're hoping that these will reach communities that we don't find always easy to reach. Our problem, not theirs. We're trying to make it a lot easier for our officers to communicate and engage kind of consistently. So we're supporting local officers in that way and giving them more accessible tools. This isn't just about senior leaders you might see in the local paper or whatever, but this is about officers on the front line, those in neighbourhoods, safer schools officers, those kinds of people. We are I'm going out, maybe a small thing, but I'm going out on the roads shortly to get round all the BCUs and listen and communicate, and hopefully also be able to give one or two, but mostly listening exercises, key messages internally and externally about our efforts to engage better and rebuild trust. You'll have seen some big events like the one perhaps we did in Croydon recently, huge community engagement events, fantastic support from people in the communities there, largely driven by them. We're trying to replicate that elsewhere. There's one coming up very shortly in Central East. A big part of this is about being more open. We believe we are very open, but we know that people don't always think that about us. We are going out to do sort of some themed engagement exercises where our media and comms people will be there, and they will first of all be listening, but then on the key issues, making sure that we do by default get information out earlier and before we're asked, and just be as open as we can. Some of this is about using new digital techniques. And some of it is about very much face-to-face. So if you thought of the Met's digital platforms 3-4 years ago, they would have been very limited. We're now quite creative, I believe, not my world, but we're up there. Our recruitment videos you may have seen. We're doing stuff on TikTok. We do stuff on YouTube. We're quite heavily on Instagram. We're much better on our narratives and our pictures now than we were just a little while ago. I know it's not all about digital commerce, but it is important. And we use people we believe will be credible and influential, particularly with young people. Use is the wrong word. We work with them to get engagement messages out, to get safety messages out, to get recruitment messages out. So that's just a flavour of it. I think too early to say what's the real impact of some of these efforts are. And of course we do work very closely with MOPAC in terms of their engagement role and try to complement them and be present when it's appropriate for us to be present at their engagement events.
You've given some really good examples
Yeah.
of the kind of work that you're doing in terms of getting engaged, doing the engagement work. What would you personally regard as an indicator of success of those various initiatives that you've taken?
Sure. Well, obviously I'm very focused on recruitment at the moment, and we have our outreach teams out there, particularly in our black communities. We're growing. This is going to be a record year for growth for the Met, and last year was a big year, but this is a record year, and over and above the numbers we brought in last year, we need to bring in 600 in the next financial year. We'll only do that if we do some really personal engagement with people, and we actually can reach out to people. So that is a very important area for me, particularly within our black communities, our Asian communities, our multiple ethnic heritage communities, of course. Secondly, we haven't developed all our metrics yet, but I want people to be seeing the Met as a more open organisation, accessible, and that, of course, we know is part of trustworthiness. And I want people to feel that they as it were, understand better who we are and what we are doing and what our role is, which is often quite difficult in a crowded communication space. And overall, of course, what we're trying to do is build people's trust and confidence and their knowledge of their rights and when they should contact us and how we can help them. So I'm sorry I've given you quite a broad range of things. We're just in the development stage of our new communication strategy, and we will be putting some really clear and much more tactical metrics against that.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner, have the additional 650 officers that are earmarked to improve community policing been put in place? And what assessment has the Met made to distribute those 650 fairly across the capital? And what impact are the officers that are in place having?
Thank you. Well, we've so far put our first tranche of town centre teams out, and that was in December. And the remaining, so that was 12 teams. The remaining 7 will come, will be launched in February 22, and then after that, we are putting, I think it's another 150 into our dedicated ward officer, our neighbourhood teams. And we have used a reasonably sophisticated way, I think, of trying to work out where they need to be placed. Of course, by definition, there are people who've got extra and some people who haven't, or some local areas that haven't. We have used, in essence, metrics around violence, which is our #1 priority, and around demand, and about deprivation. And so that has been a lot of work that's gone into it, and that has resulted in I'm not going to read out the list, you'll probably be familiar with it, but the places that we have chosen. I think I've said this already, but just to be clear, I do believe that by putting them in there, you know, I'm just picking one off my list, Hounslow Town Centre, we will reduce demand in that town centre quite considerably. We will make that a better and safer place for people to go about their daily business, including, critically, women and girls. And by reducing demand, we will free up some response capability and perhaps other capabilities that may be able to go to some of the areas that haven't got the extra officers. Finally, you may know this, but the teams are essentially 1 inspector, 3 sergeants and 21 constables. It's a bit different in Westminster because of the nature of Westminster, and we are already getting very good feedback from partners and from communities about the visibility and action and change that people are seeing. And of course, we've got lots of great examples of particular problems being solved or particular crimes being stopped or investigated better than they would otherwise have been. But we will be doing as far too early to say what the overall impact is yet. But the key thing will be, crime down, confidence up, antisocial behaviour and violence reduced.
Thank you. My final question. We've heard from representatives of safe neighbourhood boards and others at a local level that low-level ASB issues are not being dealt with properly and are then escalating into more serious crime. We've also heard that one of the main issues in dealing with ASB and low-level neighbourhood crimes properly is the rapid turnover of officers based in neighbourhood teams who deal with these issues and engage with SMTs, ward panels and other local community bodies. This isn't identified as an issue in the forced management plan, but I want to know if these things are something that you are aware of and how and is part of how the organisation is going to tackle ASB.
So I certainly am aware that people who get to know a good dedicated ward officer, and there are many, there are thousands of them, really want them to stay and love having them, and building relationships is really obviously important, and building genuine knowledge and understanding of how an area works is really important. One of the things we do, which the Deputy Mayor keeps quite a close eye on, is we have a commitment to ensuring that they work on their wards as much as reasonably possible. We take them away for aid outside the BCU as rarely as we can. Notting Hill Carnival, of course, yes, so forth, but try to reduce that. But there is a challenge with an organisation that is growing, and that is one that you have at the moment a lot of new, very welcome, very diverse, brilliantly talented, but inexperienced officers who don't have, for example, driving skills or taser skills or whatever. And on occasion, we have to take a ward officer on a daily basis to backfill, and that happened too much for my liking last year during periods of really intense public order challenges for the Met. So officers who would have been driving the response vehicle come away and are in central London with their PSU kit on, dealing with difficult protests, and then somebody has to drive the area car tonight, and that's going to be the neighbourhood officer. And then secondly, when you've got an organisation that's growing, there's a kind of pull-through of expertise and opportunity for these officers. So this is not them saying, I don't like it here, I'm tired, I'm bored. It's them saying, there's a great job over there I would like to go to, and I'm now really skilled. So a lot of our dedicated ward officers will head to the TSG. Not all, but many. Some will want to stay a lifetime, and God bless them, and thank goodness for them. But others will see it as something where they need to move on. I know I'm going on too long. Just to say, I do see it as a problem. We do look at it, keep an eye on the sort of average length of service and try to keep people there. We don't have a minimum tenure, but we do have some sort of reasonable expectations of people. I'm conscious we're not as good at it as I would like. I'm also conscious that, and this is something that is coming in very strongly, when a new person arrives, they must be introduced properly. So they must get to know, have education, if you like, about the local area and introductions to key issues and key people that is properly managed. And the same is true of BCU commanders, and I think we could do better at some of that.
Okay, Chair, I wonder if we could ask the Commissioner to provide some data on how long, on average, community officers stay in post.
Yes,
Is that possible?
At some point, that's interesting.
Right. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Very, very quickly, Commissioner. Certainly more officers out there will increase confidence, which is what we all want. And it was reported this month that the police in North Hants, Bedfordshire and Greater Manchester sent officers to every burglary to collect evidence and reassure victims, and it's seen a significant fall in burglaries. So do you think that's something that the Met should be exploring?
So I think I'm right in saying, yeah, I shall regret this if I'm wrong, but I think I'm right in saying that we have already moved to a position where if somebody asks us to come, we will. And this is something we do have under review as to whether it is, whether that will make a significant, it will certainly improve some people's satisfaction, I am sure, even if actually, practically, the officers are not able to do very, very much when they get there in terms of bringing somebody to justice. But the question of whether it actually reduces crime and will do in our current disposition is another matter. What I would say, though, is please note the very low levels. I know it doesn't feel like it to everybody, but the very low levels of burglary overall that we currently have, the big reductions that we've had this year compared with 2 years ago, we have bucked the national trend in terms of crime reduction in London, in violent crime and in other crime categories. We are seeing huge reductions at the moment. I've set out to my colleagues very clearly that one of our priorities for this coming year is to improve our detections and bring more people to justice, including, of course, absolutely more burglars. If Nick F. Graves says to me, well, what we now need to do is exactly the same as this force or that force, then I'm very open to that idea.
Thank you. It'd be interesting to look at, and it, of course, does help confidence, because if police officers visit somebody in a road, very often those people tell everybody on their WhatsApp group that the police have visited them and are grateful for that. Thank you. That finishes that section. We're now going on to the Met Forces Management Statement, the part of which is managing offenders, and that's going to be started by my colleague, Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, the Force Management Statement talks about serious youth violence, which obviously includes child sexual exploitation, modern slavery and child criminal exploitation, all of which are increasing. And it also, welcomely, talks about, rather than focusing on these offences being committed by children, it talks about the importance of that insight into why that child is offending, and sort of improved understanding around a child's complex needs and the requirement for a trauma-informed policing approach, and also for that to include an element of safeguarding. So my question for the Commissioner is, what are the key challenges for the Met in dealing with more serious offending and levels of violence amongst children?
If I may, I would like to start just by reiterating the fact that we are currently, despite the utterly horrific number of teenage homicides last year, on a strong downward trajectory in terms of violent crime involving young people. And I, of course, recognise that that headline figure and those individual lives lost is an appalling thing and a priority for me, and I know for City Hall this year. But in terms of knife injury victims under 25, after reductions in previous years, we've decreased again this year compared with its comparator year, which is 1920, by another 27%. So that's 460 odd young people not stabbed this current financial year compared with the last one. And I could say some similar things in other categories. So I think collectively we are making progress, we really are. But there are many, many challenges, as you have said. And this will be, continue to be a focus for my commissionership, I'm sure, and potentially beyond. It is as much about prevention and early intervention as it is about enforcement, of course, but we do take our enforcement responsibilities seriously. Sadly, a very high proportion of our stabbings in the city and indeed some other serious violence are committed by people who are, appallingly, remarkably young. When those of you who've been out with the Violent Crime Task Force or been out with the violence suppression units locally, you will see that sadly an awful lot of the people that they are interacting with who are getting involved in violence are very young, sometimes young teenagers or even very occasionally less. So we have worked closely with partners to improve our officers' understanding of the kinds of issues that you've talked about, adverse childhood experiences and how they play out, making sure that we work as well as we can in partnership with our colleagues in education, in children's services, in the youth offending teams, and of course also with families. We are always very careful when we arrest a child or young person to try to discover if they have been exploited or whether they've committed it on their own volition, and that's an important part of our role. It's often not an easy thing to diagnose or a binary categorization, but it's important. Often we have challenges, frankly, in terms of getting evidence or from victims or witnesses if they are children, of course. Overall, I would say the challenge we face as a sort of London society is, if I boil it down to the three things that Alex Murray has mentioned recently, we have localized social media which celebrates and encourages often violence amongst other children and young people. We have our drugs markets, I've talked about that, some huge successes in the last couple of years, particularly under Operation Orochi, which has brought exploitative offenders to justice and safeguarded hundreds of children. And then finally, the far too high prevalence of carrying weapons amongst some young people. The latter, well, for all of them really, this is why we're investing in school-based officers, why we have our youth engagement teams, and of course why we use our enforcement powers. We do use preventative approaches like the knife crime prevention orders, and we've already talked about the criminal behaviour orders, which can be helpfully applied to children. And we're always working on a multi-agency basis. But these are challenging, very challenging issues.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to pick up on the pilot scheme that's been running in the South Area BCU, where officers conduct a home visit to engage with a child and their parent or carer to offer any interventions or diversions sort of through a community resolution process. What are the key findings from this pilot scheme in the South Area BCU?
So I'm really sorry, but it is actually slightly too early to give you the answer to that. We are dip sampling there and elsewhere about the use of community resolutions actually with young people. But in terms of that pilot, it's still running. It's got another 6 weeks to go. and then we will analyse the results. So I'll come back to you then. I'm not hiding anything. We're just not in the business of analysis at the moment.
Of course. So you're saying that it's going to run for another 6 weeks, and then how much time will you need to do the analysis before you can share anything?
They haven't told me that, Caroline. I don't want to sell them short.
Okay, perhaps.
I mean, I'll try and get early findings to you within a month, say, of the completion.
That would be fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Colleagues, we're going to have to pick up pace just a little bit. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, what plans does the Met have to collaborate with youth offending team officers, police officers, to develop training for the actual youth offending team officers, and what are the timescales, please?
So youth offending team officers do have had increased training latterly. So training in trauma-informed awareness, training in evidential decision making, so to make sure that when they make a decision about what's the best thing for a child who is in the system, if I can put it that way, that's consistent. Training in the criminal behaviour orders that we talked about, extensive training around exploitation, the national referral mechanism, that's for child exploitation and modern human slavery and county lines. They have a strong and constantly being revised handbook. They have also got involved in helping the setup of our sort of local scrutiny panels. They have monthly review meetings as individuals and as teams, where the job of their supervisors is to make sure that any training gaps they have are identified and filled. And they have regular professional development events, such as recently a youth-based professional conference involving the Prince's Trust, the Dalalio Foundation and others. And they are constantly being advised around what resources and opportunities for diversion and engagement partners can give them. So, and last but not least, latterly we have introduced the use of community resolutions carefully with young people, and we've just been giving them some extra training on that when it relates to cannabis.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Very, very briefly, Commissioner, the Force Management Statement says that there's been a large increase in youths being released under investigation. So is there any work going in to make sure that they don't get into more trouble?
Yeah, this is a very challenging area. I must say, Chair, I'm extremely impressed by all your diligent reading of the Force Management Statement.
I love it. I
shall tell Sir
I'm
Tom
so sad.
Windsor, who will be absolutely delighted, because it hasn't raced off the bookshelves, it has to be said, but we do find it very useful. It's quite detailed. And now I've forgotten your question, Chair.
It's just basically with the people that are being released under
it's very
investigation.
difficult. It's very difficult. What we do is keep a constant watch on the number of people we have on bail, the number of people we have RUI'd, adults and children, and the length of time. When somebody is released under investigation, you'll be aware that there is no formal, of itself, mechanism to put any order on them or any formal expectations on them. But whenever a young person is arrested, the fact that they have been and what it was for is made known to partners and to children's services, and there should then be a follow-up action between us to try to make sure that they're not, as you say, getting into further trouble. We are held back, is probably the right word, sometimes by the length of time it takes to do the digital investigation and get the evidence back, very often by the time in which it takes to get statements from partners, from doctors and others, busy people. It's not their highest priority. We are held back then by the fact that we now have to create a full file before we can get a decision from the CPS. That full file has to be absolutely full rather than, well, the doctor will give us a statement in 3 months' time, we know that. And so sometimes there is a lot to do before we can make a decision. And we would like, of course, to reduce that time, and that's one of the aims we have, is to try to reduce that time. and also, as you say, to get greater insight and for want of a better word, control for the young person when they are released. I can't say that it works perfectly. With those who we know are at high risk and are well known to the system, then there is an enormous amount of activity after they are released to try to ensure that we take timely action, and that others, we work with the family, we work with children's services and others to try to reduce the chances of them getting involved. But the tragedy is, as you well know, a far too high proportion of boys who get stabbed or stab, kill or be killed are already within, well known to the agencies, always pretty much, and secondly, often currently released under investigation or even on bail for something.
Yep, it's a real problem. Thank you. And our last question from Assemblymember Maima.
Thank you, Chair. What plans does the Met have in place to deal with anticipated demand in managing registered sex offenders over the next few years, including returning sex offenders? And that is to the Commissioner.
Thank you very much. So we currently manage over 6,000 registered sex offenders. That number has been growing, and sadly I think it's quite likely will continue to grow. It's in the nature of the way the system works, really, that it's pretty rare for somebody to have their registration taken away, and it's a one-way system. Every time someone who commits a serious sexual offence goes to court and is dealt with, they may likely to get an order, and I'm very aware of that. What we have done recently and are currently doing is try to make sure that on average no officer is managing more than 50 offenders, and so we keep an eye on that average but also the outliers. Some boroughs, as you know, have many more per head of population than others, and some have more high-risk offenders as a proportion than others, and it's the high and medium risks that take huge amounts of work. So we try to keep the ratio right. We have, as part of our public protection plan, been paying attention to the skills of those colleagues and making sure that they are properly, not just they weren't, but that they're keeping up to date and they're properly skilled. We have been working with the Home Office and the government to try to make sure that any law changes are sort of practical and useful, and it isn't all dependent on the officers who manage so-called the sex offenders in the jigsaw teams, but also improving the awareness of other colleagues as well. The key thing that we have done, which has made their lives a lot easier recently, is two digital initiatives. We've launched a new remote internet monitoring service where we use a private contractor to monitor the internet use of an RSO, where we've got a court order that allows us to do so. It used to be a manual process. That saved us about £2 million in officers' time. And in 2021, we equipped them all, which has been a huge success, with a digital triage tool to replace manual searches of the internet. And this has begun to save time at visits. And we've also digitally enabled them in other ways so that they don't have to keep going back to the office and whatnot, so they're more flexible and more mobile. So looking forward, we want to continue with the digital savings and efficiencies, if you like, and greater effectiveness, and working with others, obviously, long term, to try to reduce sex offending overall. But we have got to just keep a real eye on the numbers and the ratios. And I think, as with one or two other issues, I sit here with a heavy heart saying this is something which is going to take a bigger proportion of police time in 5 and 10 years' time than it does now, potentially, just because it's a growing cohort. And we don't have, to go to the question, we do not have a specific plan for 5 years' time, what we think the level of resourcing will be required to be. And we've been working really a bit hand to mouth and now just looking forward a couple of years.
Okay. So just briefly, Chair, last April the government committed to strengthening the MAPA statutory guidance to include sections on domestic abuse and stalking, to ensure that agencies took steps to identify perpetrators in order to manage the risks that they represented. So just to the Deputy Mayor and to the Commissioner, have you had any indication from the government of when they intend to do what they said they would do last year? And maybe update us on what the most serious domestic abuse perpetrators, how they're managed. And if you haven't, if you could write back, that'd be really helpful.
I'm not aware that we've had any indication at all, so I'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay. And Commissioner, is that the same in your case as well?
Yes, I don't know. I don't know when that's coming. And I would just say, I think I've exemplified this already, but it is another example of where there is a shift towards a role for the police in managing offenders after the fact,
right.
and risk, so-called risk management, which is really good in theory and makes total sense, of course. We all want to do that. But it depends crucially on partners having the resources to do their bit of the job. And secondly, every hour we spend on making sure that somebody is supposed to be complying with this, that, or the other is complying with that, is an hour not spent arresting somebody else. That's not a complaint. I'm just saying we have we have an increasing responsibility here. And when people wonder why, we're stretched, that's one of the areas, that's one area where we're really, really stretched. Now, of course, if you can prevent somebody from committing a serious offence by managing them well, you save a lot as well. I get that too. But I'm getting a bit philosophical here. We need to be careful about the role of the police in all these, in the future, in these kinds of, could you please manage all that risk that cohort of offenders presents, in my view.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Pigeon.
Could I just pick up on that? It's a really interesting discussion. Your point about using a contractor to remotely manage internet access of these offenders. Are you able, I think, to provide now or in writing examples of where that's not just led to, obviously it's led to reduced officer time dealing with this, which has made a saving, but actually has led to further prosecutions and stopped offenders behaving in such a way or going further?
I'll certainly come back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And that finishes that section. We're now talking again about the Met Force Management Statement on managing serious and organised crime. It's going to be started off by my colleague, Assemblymember Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, do the Met's major investigation teams have enough officers to meet demand? Are they fully staffed with experienced officers, please?
So we have in our specialist crime teams, teams focused on homicide who are primarily reactive. Of course, they do proactive investigations. And then we have our serious organised crime teams who are primarily focused, if you like, on the front foot and proactively. They both have been carrying some vacancies, but we are now able to fill them up more. Secondly, in our restructuring that we did 3 years ago to create the Specialist Crime Command, partly by bringing them closer in their hubs to the local teams, as I described, but also through all sorts of other things, we have been able to make them, I would say, very much more efficient and very much more effective. Our homicide teams are busy, but less, they won't thank me for saying this, but less stretched than they were 18 months ago. And that's because we've boosted the team. So we had to create another couple of teams a couple of years ago. They are busy, but they get a over 90% detection rate at the moment in the main, and they're doing really well. Our proactive teams eat up work. They get fantastic results every day of the week, and there is very much more work out there for them than they are able to do. But when you turn to their results in the last couple of years, it is utterly extraordinary, not least against serious organised criminals and the suppression of gangs and the volume of guns we've been taking off the street and the reductions in serious violence as a result.
Thank you. I'm going to go on to teenage homicides. I'm just going to start by reading page 145 of the FMS that says homicide offenders are usually known to the police, with 69% having been arrested in the 12 months prior to homicide. 30% of accused have been arrested for drugs offences, 24% for violence, 20% for possession of weapons, and 9% for robbery. So the question is, the record number of teenage homicides in London in 2021 is, of course, shocking to all of us. The Met has identified that gangs and county line clashes may be driving these homicides. What actions are you taking to prevent more of these deaths? And perhaps page 145 gives you a clue.
145 of the FMS. I'm so sorry, Mr. Devenish, I didn't actually bring it with me. I know, sorry, I had it in the car. I've spoken at this committee before a lot about what we are doing and what we have done and what we have achieved. So if you start with serious organised criminals, you'll be aware of Operation Venetic, and that was called Eternal in London. We've arrested nearly 650 people in that top end serious organised criminals. Never been done in London before. That's resulted in over 500 being charged, 79 of whom have been convicted, and they've already got over 1,000 years of sentences as a result. We've seized over 1,000 kilograms of cocaine, loads of heroin, 45 guns, nearly £20 million of cash in that alone. And we've accounted for a very large part of the country's Operation Venetic results. In addition, our organised crime partnership, which is a partnership team, small team that works within the NCA, on the same operation, they've had over 90 arrests, 75 charges, and again, drugs and guns in large quantities. So that work is taking the wind out of the sails of many, many, many of the people at the top end. These are people who are importing drugs, importing and distributing firearms, some of whom, not all of whom, are absolutely ruthless in setting out to, if necessary, have people killed, and we're getting them locked up. Come down a level. We've been working extremely hard through the proactive teams I talked about, but also with the Violent Crime Task Force and to some extent the Violent Suppression Units and the whole of the Met against our gangs, being better informed about the most harmful gangs, targeting them as individuals and as groups in local areas, getting real ownership locally of those gangs, and constantly suppressing their activity as much as we can, bringing record numbers of drug dealers to court, and also, as I've mentioned, taking huge numbers of guns off the street, active, lethal, nasty firearms, at least one a day, every day, taken off the street. That's what's resulted in lethal barrel discharges being down this year by over 20%, again on last year of 2019-20, and. That's lower than the level it was in 2010 or 2012, and we now account for a very much smaller proportion of firearms discharges in the country than we once did. So I'm really pleased with that work, and I think we're on a very strong trajectory. I've mentioned knife crime, which has been coming down, gun crime generally coming down, knife crime under 25 coming down. I'm afraid when I was just flicking through my pages looking at our latest analysis, it's very similar to what you described in terms of the profile of our victims and indeed our offenders of homicide. Tragically, getting younger overall, more teenagers proportionately, more street-based, nearly all boys, and very tragically, even more concentrated sort of density, if I can put it that crude way, within our black communities. I do believe the work we have been doing on enforcement, which is what I've been talking about, has been having a big impact. And then there's all the work that the BRU partners and we have been doing in relation to diversion and early intervention. I mentioned it before. I think we're doing the right things. I think we're getting a better understanding all the time. and our high-profile presence in the hotspots, partly through the town centre teams and other uniform officers like our violence suppression officers, also, of course, our predatory offender units, primarily or entirely focused on those who are predatory towards women and children, getting them locked up quickly. I think we are absolutely doing the right things. We're getting more resources, and I'm confident that this trajectory is going to continue in the right way. Of course, I wish there wasn't a single teenager killed in London, and we want to reduce that number passionately. Every single one of my officers cares about that.
Thank you. Page 152 of the same document says there are 165 suspended homicide investigations. Why is this, please, and what is being done to get these investigations live again?
So I don't know what the number is now, but on occasion and at any one time, we will suspend an investigation where there is, thank you, nothing sort of obvious that is going to be lost by that, and where we have higher priority, newer, usually not always, but opportunities in other homicide investigations. So we are always, sounds horrible, but we're always managing a moving kind of cohort. If you speak to any of my senior investigating officers, they will have very current investigations going through court at the point of sentencing, and of course the timescale between charge and sentence is now very narrow, so they have to focus on that. They have to focus on their custody time limits. They have to focus on getting the forensics back on those immediate and high priority things, because if they don't, then that case is going to be lost. We'll know that the offender was, with Cressida and Sophie, and they're walking out of custody and they're not being convicted. That cannot be allowed to happen. These other cases are ones where they are more complex and perhaps older, and so each senior investigating officer will be carrying some cases from the past. These are ones where we've done a forensic review and it has indicated there may be an opportunity we didn't think we had, or some intelligence has come in. As long as that is not urgent and high priority, the case might remain suspended until they can do it. But this is the skill of the senior managers and the senior investigating officers to constantly prioritise and reprioritise to try to get justice for everyone, because all families, whoever they are, where there is a possibility of bringing somebody to justice, deserve that, but they have to manage that all the time. Of course, I'm sure my homicide teams would like even more resources, and they would say they could get through some of those suspended operations faster. Sometimes something is suspended and we go back to it for 1 year, every other year, and nothing happens during that period. Then an opportunity arises and we bring people to justice. And as you know, we quite often bring people to justice now 5, 10, 15 and 20 years ago, and that's a good thing.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor, did you want to add anything in terms of the record number of teenage homicides last year, please?
Well, I would reiterate what the Commissioner's said, and also the Mayor has said many times of, what a tragic record we've reached in London in terms of 30 young teenagers losing their lives. And notwithstanding that, to remember that underneath that we are seeing reductions in knife crime with injury for under 25s. What I would add to what the Commissioner said in relation to, well, what are we doing about this, is that myself and MOPAC and the VRU and right across City Hall are convening partners regularly on this matter to look at that analysis, not just in the force management statement, but the analysis, newer analysis in terms of victims and offenders, as to what else can we be doing. Are there any gaps? Is there anything we should be enhancing? Where are the particular areas of London where there are particular issues, and what we can do to work in partnership? That's a regular meeting that we have, that I either chair or the Chief Executive of MOPAC chairs, with our partners, with probation, with the Youth Justice Board, with the London councils, and obviously with the Violence Reduction Unit and with the Metropolitan Police. I think that focus is really helping in terms of supporting the Met and the enforcement tactics that they are undertaking, and really looking at the areas of London and the individuals who are most at risk. There's still some work to be done as to how far you really can hone down the areas, but how far you can really hone down in terms of individuals. Because yes, many were involved in the criminal justice system already, but when you look at the numbers involved in the criminal justice system, what protective measures can you put around those that are the most vulnerable? What can you do with youth offending teams or the boroughs or with community groups to really support those young people who are vulnerable, who are at risk, and support them not to get more involved, and support them to stay safe as well?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Colleagues, we need to pick up speed again. Please, Assemblymember Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Chair. This is a question for you both. Last year was a truly tragic year in terms of the number of young people who were murdered across the city, and that's a personal tragedy for every single one of those families. The Commissioner, you earlier, however, voiced optimism about the clear fall in the number of young victims of knife crime. And in recent years, whilst this has been ongoing, it's been ongoing since 2018, so clearly there's a downward trajectory for this. In both your opinions, what has led to this fall, and can you explain why, as yet, there's been no correlation between this and the number of youth homicides in London? I wonder, Deputy Mayor, if you could start.
So in relation to what's driving the teenage murders at the moment, I think the Commission's already talked about the analysis and the professional judgment of Commander Alex Murray around some of the use of social media locally.
Sorry, Deputy Mayor, would you mind speaking a little bit closer to your mic? Thank you.
Sorry, some of the use of social media, the drugs market, and the prevalence of young people carrying knives. Now, clearly, that's a symptom of young people carrying knives, and rather than we need to drive down in terms of the cause of those young people carrying the knives, and that's very much what the Violence Reduction Unit is doing at the moment. Really looking at what the drivers are, and in the same way as I've answered Tony Devonish's answer, really looking at what we can do to support those young people. One of the things that I didn't intervene on when Caroline asked the question around the challenges for the Met in relation to serious youth violence, I think one of the things the Commissioner didn't pick up on is actually coming out of COVID, there is a real serious challenge because the vulnerabilities of young people have been exacerbated because of COVID, because of those young people who were who are most in need of being in full-time education, were the least likely to be in full-time education, those who are most in need of having their vulnerabilities picked up were the least likely to have their vulnerabilities picked up. And you can see it in the referrals because the schools were not open in the way that they could be. Services weren't functioning in the way that they have been functioning. I think that's a huge challenge going forward in relation to picking up on the vulnerabilities. And one of the things that we really are looking at in terms of teenage murders around what more can we do to work together, and how we can work with government to put the right services in place for London.
Thank you. Commissioner.
Thank you. Well, just to say that thank you for observing the trend, which, as you say, does go back to 2018, which was a horrible year in many respects. And to say that, latterly we have been bucking very considerably, either well ahead of or bucking the national trend. So you'll find many, many cities in this country that can't say what we're saying about the reductions that we have seen. We're also bucking the international trend, to take to a large extent, to take the Deputy Mayor's point. You look across all the big American cities, and violent crime, firearms crime, and murders of all sorts, and stabbings, and goodness knows what, has gone through the roof. And it hasn't here. We have continued with, as we've begun to not come out of COVID, but have a kind of different way of managing COVID and different levels of COVID, we have continued with our reductions. And that's one of the things that gives me optimism, despite the extra challenge that Sophie rightly identifies. So I think I've said, more resources has been really welcome, initially from the Mayor and then from the government. We've been able to create our violence suppression units. We have our very strong violent crime task force. We have got better, I think, in our specialist crime work in the ways I've described. And I think that has had a real impact. In addition to the diversion work that others and we do, like Divert in our custody suites, and some of the work we've done to improve information coming in from the communities. For example, our Hard Calls Save Lives campaign. So we've been, I would sort of characterise it as very clearly, this has been and remains the #1 priority for Met people under my commissionership. There is an absolutely unrelenting focus on what can we do to reduce violent crime as it affects young people, and in particular, how can we reduce teenage homicides. Unfortunately, when you look at some of the teenage homicides, latterly what you do see, not absolutely everyone, but an awful lot of them, you do see that this is a group activity. These are, not always pre-planned, but certainly very violent, very vicious, and very determined attacks, often by a group. And so Sophie's point about people and places is vital. You know, you don't set out to go and do that today if you've not done something similar or before together. You know, it's not an easy thing to do, to go and to show such horrific levels of aggression and violence. And so our unrelenting work against drugs, against gangs, against the higher level serious organised criminals, together with all the presence and visibility that we're now able to create through new resources, and being there at the right time, in the right place, when something's just happened, to arrest people. You'll have seen the horrible incident in Selfridges the other day. We made an arrest straight away. You know, maybe 3 years ago we wouldn't have been able to make 3 arrests, actually. This is important, and we are utterly focused on violent crime and trying to get our young people away from it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Question is to the Commissioner. We're looking at organised gang. How many organised crime gangs are currently operating in London, and what are your key priorities for tackling these and disrupting their operations, Commissioner?
So we have a concept called high harm gangs, and these we've identified 59 of the most dangerous and causing the greatest harm. That links to their serious violence, their drug supply, county lines, and firearm discharges. We have mapped them and looked at them as though they were, as it were, old-fashioned, proper, organised crime groups. And then we have a multifaceted approach to them, looking at how we don't just bring them to justice, but how we absolutely disrupt their activity, how we divert those who are on the edges of getting drawn in or already drawn in, how we use court powers and other powers to best ability to restrict people's lifestyles. Sometimes, for example, it's very helpful for a young person to have a restriction on their lives which says to them, you can't associate with these people, or you can't go to that area, because they're then able to say to the gang that's bullying them, I just can't, I'm not coming. And so it's a sort of sophisticated top to bottom approach. We have recorded what we call disruptions of gang activity, again at record levels this year. And we are always looking to see how, there are a lot of gangs, sadly, in London, in the city, not alone, but going for the highest harm ones and really trying to disrupt and smash up their activities, and then making sure that at all times we're trying to reduce the harm to individuals who are on the edges or involved with those groups, including girls, and being quick to recognise the threat that they may pose. So, it sounds easy taking a gun off a street every day. I can tell you it really isn't. And it requires brilliant intelligence work. It requires brilliant decision makers. It requires very brave, usually firearms officers, and colleagues who are absolutely on it 24 hours a day, scanning what's happening, looking at where they can, getting intelligence, looking at social media, seeing who's angry with who, what's going to happen next, being in the right places at the right times. I think if you were to speak to many of the gang members in London, they are hugely aware that the focus and ability of the Met now is very much stronger against them than it was, sadly, able to be a few years ago.
And the Violent Crime Task Force, also at the BCU level,
yeah.
Do you think they have sufficient support?
So the Violent Crime Task Force are essentially a pan-London resource. However, they are deployed very, very locally, and their role is to work alongside other local teams to really understand the challenges of the area, the hotspot places, and indeed to get to know the individuals who are most likely to be at risk of being a victim or an offender. And I think I'm right in saying that the Violent Crime Task Force now has about 330 odd people in it, That includes Operation Venice, who you'll remember are people who've reduced hugely moped-enabled robbery. And they have been a very important part of our huge reductions in robbery over the last couple of years as well. I think they are probably at the capacity they should be at, and they're very highly motivated and they're doing a great job. Doesn't mean if I had twice the size, we couldn't give even more to each BCU. Of course we could. We also have the violence suppression units who are highly local, and they are primarily in uniform. They are out problem solving, they're out doing partnership working, they're out getting to know very well their local at-risk people, and they are newer, and again, I'm sure they would like to be bigger. There's always more work to do, but I'm content with their levels of resourcing at the moment. In the latter case, we do attach some of our newer probationers to them, which gives them a real taste for that sort of work, gets them in amongst some of the youngsters who are most at risk, and I think is a really good way of giving them confidence in dealing with some quite challenging issues on the street often. But also we just have to get that balance right. We can't have too many new officers doing that sort of work because it is challenging, and they are often challenged as they're going about it.
Thank you. As I'm sure you're aware, I think it was last week or the week before, the Mayor made an announcement in relation to soft drugs like cannabis, and I think he said he was setting up some kind of commission to look at whether or not people should be arrested or whether or not people should be charged. Of course, he hasn't got any powers to do any of that, but obviously he may ask via the Deputy Mayor whether or not you should see that as a priority. What are your views on that? Do you think that would be a good thing?
So obviously the Deputy Mayor is qualified to talk about the Drugs Commission much more than I am. Suffice to say, I think that has been talked about for a little while, and whatever that consists of, within reason, if we can assist with our expertise or advice or information, then we will of course support it, just as we would if something similar was being set up by another, if there was a government-led body or something. In relation to any announcement around changing approach, we are not changing our approach, and I have no intention of doing that at the moment at all. I've always tried to be open to new initiatives, and you'll be aware that, for example, in the government's Tony Sewell-led work, there is a suggestion there in relation to young black boys that the relationship between the Met and policing and young black boys might be improved, and involvement of young black boys in the criminal justice system might be reduced if something like what I think has been being talked about might be introduced. So I'm not saying never, but I'm very clear. Nobody has spoken to me about any change. We're not making any change. We go through the processes we go through with young people on the street, which does now include community resolution as an option. But I have no hesitation in saying we are focused on drug dealing, and drug dealing includes very frequently either polydrugs, including cannabis, or is cannabis drug dealing, which is associated often with very serious violence. And that's my number one priority, so we will still be arresting people in relation to that.
Would it help if I clarified what you seem to have got slightly mixed up? Two things slightly mixed up. One is which was a manifesto commitment from May, commitment in the Mayor's manifesto to set up a drugs commission to look at the best ways of reducing the harm that cannabis the harm of cannabis. That drugs commission is being set up at the moment. We're working to set up that, and we hope to be able to make some announcements of that in the next couple of months. The second thing I think that you've got slightly, putting together was premature reporting of a possible pilot in Lewisham around the use of community community resolutions for young adults, and then extra support being put in. Those are discussions that we're having. It's a very, it's very much along the lines of, we've had questions today about a pilot in the South BCU around community resolutions and extra support being put in for young people, for children, young people. This is very much along those lines. There are discussions that are being had at the moment. We all know that diversion can work, and we have other examples of where diversion is working, for example, on female offending. Those are the two things that have happened recently. Well, not recently, Mayor's Manifesto was last May, and it's really that's ongoing discussions that we're having at the moment. There's been no decisions taken.
And that's interesting.
Sorry, can I just also add, I don't want to be disrespectful in any way, but just to say, as Sophie knows, there's been no discussions with Met Management Board, which talks about early announcement of something or other. There have been no discussions between our organisations at senior levels about whether this should or shouldn't, or how it might go ahead.
I'm being looked at by the chair, so I just want to ask just one more question. Obviously, that what you're saying is true. There are two different issues, Deputy Mayor. But what's your position on drugs and soft drugs?
Beg your pardon, what's my position on what?
Soft drugs, whether or not they should be legalised, whether or not the police
Well,
should
that's
or
why
should
we've
not
set up the
prosecute.
London Drugs Commission to look at what is the best legislative
Yeah, I wasn't
framework
asking-
for.
I was asking
I will wait to see
your
what the
opinion.
experts of the commission that we've set up, and we will look at what evidence they produced, the research, and their recommendations around that.
So you don't have a position yourself?
I think there should be that informed debate in the way that we want to have, and we are having an informed debate, but I think actually we ought to learn lessons from abroad. We ought to think about what the best ways are to reduce the harm, to tackle violence, but also to reduce individual harm as well of cannabis. And that's why we set up the London Drugs Commission, to get that view and get the view of experts.
So you don't have a position. Thank you.
Okay, I aimed to be finished by 12:30, so I'm failing miserably. I'll leave it to Assemblymember Pigeon to make sure I don't fail too long, please. And if we could have shorter responses, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, I've got 3 questions to ask. One of them is, we've been talking about your capacity in all these complex areas, but do you feel the Met has sufficient capacity and trained staff to deal effectively with reports of online child sexual abuse and exploitation, and also the requirements that are coming down the line in the Online Harms Bill?
We have invested recently in online child sexual exploitation, as you know. We have recently put a large number of extra officers into that area because of further referrals coming in to us, and we need to do that. We have also been working very hard to improve our digital capability and create greater efficiency and put in place new tools for those officers so that their time is best spent. It's a massive challenge globally, and it's a massive challenge in the United Kingdom. We have some fantastic results all the time, not least from our online work, where we are looking at those people who may be in the online space but are also risk contact offenders potentially, who actually will want to go out and meet children and groom children on the street. And every other week we get an arrest or a charge in relation to somebody in that category. So it's a big challenge. It is one we take seriously. I wish I could say that I was confident that in the future, through better methods by others, including platform providers, the demand on us would reduce. I'm not completely confident about that, but that must be the way forward. And of course, the Online Harms Bill is very much about prevention, and it is about the responsibility of those who support the internet and the platforms in their various different ways, playing their part. Very hard to know at this stage what the extra demand may be for us from the Online Harms Bill. I thoroughly support and always have, not a political point, the sort of aims of it. And we have recently, in fact, I had a personal sort of 3-hour session with Ofcom, the lead of Ofcom and their team, about how things may work in the future. And one thing that, of course, would concern us, which we want to make sure doesn't happen, is that, and I hope won't, but that providers will say, oh, we don't like the look of this, could the police have a look at it? We don't need that, thank you very much. What we need is providers saying, you can't put this sort of material up, we've got a barrier that stops it. Or as soon as it goes up, we've taken it down again, sorry. Or you keep putting the wrong stuff up, you're banned. That's what we need. We don't need an extra shunt of work to us. And that's what we're trying to achieve. But I think it must be, in broad terms, I'm not trying to predict the debate in Parliament or say anything inappropriate for a police chief, but I am very supportive of the direction of travel.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you. And then another area is around dealing with the significant rise we've seen in economic and cybercrime. What are the key challenges here? Have you the right resources and systems in place here?
So I think this is something that the committee have looked at a couple of times recently, and probably in more detail. I will always sort of defend what the Met has done in terms of investing more in this area than many other forces, and our cyber capability working with the NCA is strong. The challenges, as you know, are manifold. Firstly, volume and the increasing volume that there is out there, particularly in terms of fraud, and secondly, the fact that many of the perpetrators, by no means all, but many of the perpetrators are based overseas. So we are looking, as a country, we have to look very strongly at prevention and protection as opposed to enforcing our way out of the problem. We have some fantastic proactive money laundering teams, again, seizing record volumes of cash this year, and we have had some wonderful results in relation to economic crime. The lead, as you know, is with the City of London Police and the national agencies, and we work closely with them on policy and with government. I don't feel, as a service, proud of, I'm not talking about the Met nationally, I think many people would say, overall, our service to fraud victims is not how I would like it in an ideal world to be. But prevention and protection has to be the major focus for the future. A great deal of what happens is because, I, or perhaps even you, Caroline, are careless about our security, and it's too easy, perhaps, arguably, getting into hot water here, to just say to the bank, well, sorry, this has happened, or say to another thing, give me my money back. But we try always to look at each fraud dissemination that comes to us and see what has the harm been to an individual. So we don't just deal with the big ones. We do take very seriously where somebody's life has been wrecked by a fraud, and we will always try to bring people to justice where we can, or help others so to do.
Okay, thank you. And the final area I'm just sweeping up here is around modern slavery, and the FMS states modern slavery and human trafficking offences in London continue to rise year on year. What more can the Met be doing to safeguard victims of modern slavery?
I think I'm right in saying that actually it has stabilised a little bit very latterly. But I think probably to do with the pandemic, and it may of course be that it's become more hidden rather than less. I fully accept that. But we have the overall number of offences reported to us and investigations that we're undertaking have reduced slightly. As you know, the serious and complex ones are dealt with, and I think very well. Centrally, and we're seen by the Slavery Commissioner and others as genuinely very capable in that area, and we work very well with our international partners on those cases which involve people coming from overseas, particularly labour and sex work, and we have really good collaborative relationships with those, sadly, countries which are the most common ones of origin, not least Romania and Albania, but others as well, Nigeria as well. We have done a great deal of work with our local officers. It's been a running issue. I'm sure I can remember you asking me about this probably 10 years ago, to try to improve all their knowledge. And just in recent times, thousands and thousands of officers have had more training on modern slavery and on safeguarding. County lines has been a great example of this. I haven't gone on and on about Orochi today, but I normally do. Huge numbers of county lines closed in the last couple of years. Fantastic results. These are people who operate county lines that are out in the counties, plural, but also they're gang members here, and many of them run lines locally. We're adopting the approach that we've taken with other colleagues around the country now locally, so you'll see a real push on county lines within, it's probably the wrong word, but exploitative lines within your boroughs and the BCUs in the next year. And each time the officers are working with partners. They have a good understanding of exploitation. They have a good understanding when they need to recognise that this person is exploited, not just, if you like, an offender, or sometimes not even an offender, and a good relationship with the CPS. We have some really good partners to work with, people who will always turn out at 3 in the morning. I went on one not that long ago myself, doing a raid on a brothel. They'll always turn out to help take care of people who wish to find a new way of life, often from overseas. Our victim navigators are very important. These are people who make a huge difference as to whether somebody will end up giving evidence or not. Some of them are ex-police officers, many not, but a really good recent initiative. And we coordinate well with other forces. But it is mostly hidden, a huge issue. And something I can say confidently my teams are much more knowledgeable about and better at, particularly, not least, the safeguarding aspects of it. But more to do, of course.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Boff, only if it is very, very quick. And one answer, please, Commissioner, to whatever it is.
I am the most unpopular Assembly Member in this room for coming in at the end, but the granting of leave to remain is a really important tool to encourage victims of human trafficking to come forward and indeed to dissuade them from, to prevent them from being just sent back home where they're re-trafficked. Do you maintain figures on how often the leave to remain has been offered to victims of human trafficking? You can say I'll write to you. That would be fine. You can say I'll write to you because I'm very conscious.
I don't know that we do. I'm not sure that it is something I can find for the Met, but if I can find it, I would of course want to.
Thank you very much. And
Thanks.
Just to re-emphasise, you can't expect people to come forward if they're victims.
Yes.
If they're then told as soon as they come forward, they're going to be sent back to the place they tried to escape from.
You will understand that the responsibility doesn't lie with us.
Yeah, but it's something that the Met can offer. But I'll leave it there. Thank you.
It's a fair point. Okay, thank you very much. That concludes the questioning. And I'd like to thank our guests very much for attending this morning and for the answers to our questions. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the report, the discussion and the monthly report received from MOPAC? Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from this meeting? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 2nd of February 2022 at 10 a.m. in the London Fire Brigade headquarters, which is indeed where we are in Union Street. I have no other urgent business, so it concludes today's meeting.